Okay, so if I were to ask the average furry what they think is the coolest thing that comes from the furry fandom, they'd be quite spoiled for choice. Many would say the wide variety of styles of art that they can get. Others might say it's the friends that they have made in this community. But I'm willing to bet that when posed with this question, most furries would say that the coolest thing that comes out of the furry fandom are the fursuits. And I wouldn't blame them. I mean, if you really think about it, the entire idea behind wearing a fursuit is utterly fascinating. You get to have the privilege of literally embodying the otherwise fictional anthropomorphic fursona and get a chance to perform not just as yourself, but also as the character that you spent so much time carefully designing. And sure, I might be just a little bit biased, especially since I'm wearing one right now, but fursuits have become so synonymous with the furry fandom that many people actually believe that you need to have one to even call yourself a furry. Now, I hope you all know that that definitely isn't the case, but despite only around 15% of furries having fursuits, these walking, talking, fluffy carpets are the most publicly visible demonstration of the general principle of this fandom, sharing a love for anthropomorphic animals. But even with that being the case, there's something even more interesting about fursuits, specifically about how they look. Except for some rare exceptions, they actually don't look like real animals at all. There are all these strange colors and shapes and sizes, so much so that you can make the argument that they don't really do a good job representing anthropomorphic versions of real animals and look more like an entirely different set of fantastical creatures. But why is that? Why do fursuits stray away from looking like the actual animals they're trying to represent? Did this happen by accident, or was this a conscious decision made by the fandom as a whole? Or, in other words, why do fursuits look so outlandish, so eye-popping, so cartoony? Well, to find out why, we have to take a step back and look at what fursuits are designed to accomplish. In a vast majority of cases, fursuits are made as a way to physically represent someone's fursona or character. It's pretty similar to cosplay. They allow someone to totally encompass themselves in something that represents a character that otherwise doesn't have a physical, real-world embodiment, and allows them to give that fictional character a real-life representation. As far as fursuits go, most of them are created based off a furry fursona who, among many other things, is how someone wants to be seen in the fandom. And because they're based on fursonas, fursuits take on all the unique traits that make fursonas so special as well. Because they represent individual, unique people, fursonas and their corresponding fursuits are inherently one-of-ones and are not replicated anywhere else. In fact, if you were to try to get a fursuit of a character that someone already has, you will undoubtedly be turned down, since in this community, that would be considered theft, or at the very least, plagiarism. So when asking why fursuits look a certain way, we have to look at the fursonas that they're portraying, and you don't have to look very hard to see that most fursona designs can get pretty crazy. Just look at the fur of any given number of fursonas. Fursona fur designs come in all sorts of colors, many times mixing and matching patterns that would look outlandish if replicated on a real animal. And that's not even to mention that quite a few fursonas are actually mashups of 2 or more different animals together, which only adds to the wonderful weirdness of it all. So when tasked with constructing a fursuit of characters like these, fursuit makers take those crazy design cues and incorporate them into the costumes that they create. This results in fursuits that have exaggerated features like oversized paws or ears, all while wrapped in a variety of bright and eye-popping colors. Most furries in the fandom call this fursuit style cartoony, and I personally can't think of anyone who exemplifies this cartoony idea better than a fursuit maker named More for Less. These suits are famous for taking that idea of exaggeration and turning it up to 11. I mean, just look at these things: the huge eyes, the thick thighs, the massive ears and paws. These definitely look more like something out of a cartoon than real life. And More for Less has become rather famous for this look, to the point where their suits are impossible to miss, even in a large crowd of other fursuits. Now that's all well and good, but there is something that is still not really adding up here. Let's go back to the fundamental concept of what being a furry means. At its most strict definition, a furry is an enthusiast and celebrator of anthropomorphic animals, or animals that have human features. So when interpreting the idea through things like art, which inherently fursuits are, why does most furry art quickly get away from making anthro characters that still look like the animals that they're basing them from? Shouldn't things be just a little more even? Well, from a purely technical standpoint, that all makes sense, but there's actually a very good reason why fursonas and their corresponding fursuits look as crazy as they do. As counterintuitive as it may seem, many furries might want their fursona to be a wolf or a tiger or a husky, but don't want them to look like a real version of that animal at all. And that's mainly due to a concept called the uncanny valley effect. For those who are unaware, the uncanny valley is how we define the sense of unease or even revulsion to something that we experience that is not quite human. It's that weird, unsettling feeling you get when you see something that you know should not represent a real person, but still looks like it definitely could be mistaken for a real human. There are many examples of this idea in all sorts of media, but can also be seen in things like science and technology as well. But my favorite example to give people when explaining this idea actually comes from a movie. Do you remember the movie Cats? Yes, the one based on the Broadway musical by the same name that came out in 2019? That movie became infamous for the costume choice, if you can even call it that, of adding just a few animalistic features to otherwise regular human bodies. This resulted in these weird humans that had cat features things that we as an audience watching that movie were supposed to believe were actual cats. And don't worry if you haven't seen it, as someone who has seen it twice, both in theaters, that suspension of belief didn't work, like, at all. Now, this is all still relevant to furries because when creating fursuits, fursuit makers are trying to avoid creating something that gives people looking at them that same sense of unease. Only in this case, fursuit makers run into the opposite end of the spectrum and try to avoid having their costumes look too much like real animals. This is a particular challenge that fursuit makers have that something like traditional artists don't have that much of a problem with. Even when making art with anthropomorphic animal characters with features that do look like they came from real animals, it's still easy to hold that suspension of disbelief, since most art in this medium is static. Like, it doesn't move, it's just there. Fursuits, on the other hand, are made to be worn and performed in, giving them the life and animation that makes them so special. But when you give that same life and animation to something that looks like a real animal, that starts to make many people both in and outside of the fandom feel rather uncomfortable. It crosses into that uncanny valley where seeing something that you know isn't a real animal, but sure looks and acts like one, becomes rather unpleasant. Now, even with all of that being said, like most things in life, there are exceptions to every rule, and that also includes fursuits that look less cartoony and a bit more realistic. Because those fursuits do exist, and many furries have them as the physical representations of their personas, and for what it's worth, I really like them. In fact, if I was in the position to get a second fursuit, I would actually get a suit that looks a lot more realistic than this one. And the fact that these suits still exist in this fandom brings up an interesting question. Why do suits that have more accurate animalistic features still work in this fandom and not cross too far into the uncanny valley to where fursuit makers wouldn't create them in the first place? Well, if I'm honest, that's a really good question. One that even after researching this idea a fair amount, I don't have a solid answer for you. But here are some of my theories. Firstly, the fact that these suits are still designed to be worn while walking upright on two legs is enough to keep those suits from being completely uncomfortable to see. Now, even as I say that, there's an exception to that rule as well, and quad suits are a thing. But there's so much more involved with the design and how one has to perform in one that, again, most of them stay clear from falling all the way into the uncanny valley. Secondly, because these suits are rather few and far between, their rarity actually makes them something more unique in and of themselves. In fact, I don't know about you, but at least for me, it can be actually refreshing to see a fursuit that looks a lot more realistic in a crowd of cartoony creatures, and that intrigue alone takes precedence over any feelings of unease. Thirdly, at the end of the day, a more realistic fursuit is just as valid a way of how a furry may want the idea of an anthropomorphic animal character to be realized for them in this fandom. The beauty of the concept of furry is that everyone can have their own take on it, and there's a lot of furries out there that think that all of us looking like real animals that just happen to walk on two legs would look pretty cool. In fact, again, if I'm completely honest, I actually think that level of anatomical accuracy is a lot more interesting to think about than a bunch of brightly colored colored creatures running around everywhere. But even though I personally like those types of suits a lot, they are still the minority in this fandom, mainly for the reasons we just went over, but also for more practical reasons, like cost. Realistic fursuits tend to be a lot more expensive than their cartoony counterparts, making them simply not worth it for a lot of furries. From the more animalistically colored fur to trying to fit the dimensions of real animals onto a costume that humans can wear comfortably, the parts and labor of making fursuits that look more like real animals tend to drive up the cost a good amount. So for the most part, the suits that you'll end up seeing in this fandom are bright, flashy, and cartoony, all to keep the playful fantasy of having anthro-animal characters alive and not too uncanny for most people. Now, I do want to reiterate here that this cartoony style of fursuits is more of a design convention, not a rule. One of the great things about this fandom is that you have a lot of freedom when it comes to how you want to be seen and represented in this community. And whether that's in a physical form like a fursuit, or just in the art that you get of your persona, it is ultimately up to you where you want to put the location of your slider along the line of fully human to fully animal. But even so, there are still good reasons why that fursuit design convention exists. In a community that is so involved in fantasy, creating something physical and designed to have life that breaks that fantastical contract really starts to weird a lot of people out, furry or otherwise. And as a result, that's why you end up seeing things like blue wolves, green tigers, and purple panthers. It's all done to keep the magic of this fandom alive while putting it into something that exists in the real world. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you again for watching. I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.